Thanks so much for the invitation. I want to, start by saying we're celebrating the Anteater Virtues Project at LMU in particular. We're really grateful for it. We're celebrating it by stealing most of it from you. We've got a recent grant for our LMU Intellectual Character Initiative. That really is. It's basically borrowing from you guys and trying to do some things that are distinctive in virtue of our Jesuit environment. But thanks for the inspiration and happy to celebrate. I wish I had more to give you than this talk just to be grateful, but you get what you get. Okay, so here's my core question today. I'm interested in this. How is the intellectually virtuous person supposed to handle the fact that there are far too many things worth knowing and understanding than any of us could possibly pursue? And I expect that there are at least two main animators of my own reflections on this question today. One of these motivators is pathetic. One I'm hoping is not quite so pathetic. Here's the admittedly pathetic motivator. As you can see, I'm an aging academic, and I'm increasingly aware of all the understanding I simply will not be able to achieve. So some of the obstacles to the achievement are due to particular forms of my unique incapacity. I'm just not smart enough or creative enough or dedicated enough to access all of the range of epistemic goods that I concede would be intrinsically excellent to be able to get. But there's another kind of obstacle, and it's a global one faced, I trust, by all of us, namely that we're limited and contingent. I look around the room, I think I'm seeing no beings that exist. Everybody looks like you're contingent in some regard. So we're all going to run out of time, for example, to pursue all of the epistemic goods. So the pathos in my own case in reflecting on this as I'm seeing it is coming from the sense that what I have to say now about the intellectual virtues in this context can have the timbre of a midlife crisis. Or maybe a little past midlife crisis, if you'll allow it. So be it. I'm going to deal with that. Now here, what I'm hoping is not quite so pathetic a motivation is this. It seems to me that the intellectually virtuous people handle their epistemic contingency well. This is part of their virtue. That is, it seems to me that part of the job of the intellectual virtues is to position us well with respect to the blooming, buzzing confusion of epistemic value. So those characterized by intellectual virtue have made an intelligent and admirable peace with their limitations, maintaining an ongoing commitment to inquiry, but without being overwhelmed by the limitless range of the domain. How do they achieve this balance? So my sketchy preliminary answer is going to appeal to the admittedly controversial idea of an epistemic calling or a vocation. Not vocation as a job, but vocation, Latin vocatio, of something that summons you, something that calls out to you. Okay. So let me try some of this. Now, by way of introduction to this, it might be nice to be able to deal with this thing I'm thinking of as our cognitive distribution problem, how we're going to get our attention on the right things given our limitations. It might be nice to deal with that without appealing to the concept of vocation, thereby avoiding any of the theological baggage that's stacked up around the notion of calling, for example. And here's a natural route, you might think, to a non-vocational strategy. It could run through the concept of epistemic importance. So it is, after all, intuitive to expect intellectually virtuous people to direct their cognitive energies, not just at any old knowledge and understanding, but rather at important knowledge, worthy understanding, significant epistemic goods, thereby delimiting the range of our cognitive responsibility. So in his forthcoming book, Inquiry and Agency, actually it's not forthcoming, Jason Behr's book, Inquiry and Agency, it has fallen from the press. We wait to see if it was stillborn, I guess, right? But in his now recently published book, Inquiry and Agency, Jason stops short of offering a formal theory of epistemic importance, but he does lay crucial groundwork for such a theory. And he draws some conclusions that can advance our understanding of how the intellectually virtuous person handles the confrontation with dramatic epistemic pluralism. So as Behr frames his discussion, we face two competing images of epistemic significance. One is a subjectivist image and the other is an objectivist image. On the fully subjectivist rendering, epistemic importance just bottoms out in what individual persons find interesting or engaging. So on this view, all epistemic importance is importance to the knowing agent. And now, admittedly, accepting this picture of epistemic importance would help with our larger question. So what should I be giving my epistemic attention? Well, whatever interests me, whatever I want to, really. But Baer concludes, and rightly I think, that approaches in this completely subjectivist spirit fail to account for the way that our considered sense of a good epistemic life is attuned to values beyond the individual's personal sensibilities. A person with capacities and opportunities for understanding the human psyche, or complex literature, or the biochemical underpinnings of the health sciences, or whatever, but who gives their cognitive attention only to trivial matters about 1970s era baseball stats, is less intellectually admirable than they could be. No slight on 1970s baseball stats. I'm for those too, but that would be too narrow. A life focused only on those would be epistemically impoverished. So the alternative that Baer favors is robustly objectivist, but in a way that has room for some subjective elements. So this is to say that he rejects, and again, rightly by my lights, a simple absolutism about epistemic significance. Instead, he prefers a hybrid view, according to which there are indeed some questions we do well objectively to try to answer, some topics of inquiry, the investigation of which would contribute to the personal excellence of anyone who took them up, even while some aspects of epistemic importance can be tied to personal interest and context. So, which are these objectively important questions and what makes them so? Tough questions, for sure. Baer takes inspiration from Stephen Grimm's account of objective importance in terms of a search for deep dependency relationships, while also recognizing the reasonable challenges of a simple version of this view. Nevertheless, Baer claims, and I'll concede, that Grimm is onto something here. To seek to understand the basic structure of physical reality, of moral demand, of consciousness, of well-being, the like of these, deep dependency relationships about things that matter to the human condition, thinking about these things, we do well as an epistemic agent. Still, Baer suggests that, quote, our subjective epistemic interests or preferences can be a source of epistemic importance, unquote. And this is in part because the goodness of the freedom or control we get to exercise over the shape of our own intellectual lives. So he says this, quote, the idea is that one good-making feature of an intellectual life is the ability to pursue, within certain objective limits, knowledge of topics we're curious about, such that knowledge of these topics makes our intellectual lives go better, which in turn makes these topics epistemically important for us. Okay, I hope you can tell I like all of this. And I grant that it does indeed provide us with an account of how the epistemically virtuous person is able to make some headway with the challenge of well distributing her cognitive energy. At least it does so with one additional feature that Baer accepts, namely that it's part of intellectual virtue to judge well of epistemic importance. That's partly what the intellectually virtuous person is able to do, to recognize epistemic significance. So the picture that emerges of intellectually virtuous persons then is one according to which they not only exhibit intellectual carefulness, courage, and tenacity, but also in which they characteristically aim their cognitive attention at epistemically significant projects and questions. On this view, even if someone were consistently careful, courageous, and tenacious with respect to inquiry into the details of, say, 1970s era baseball statistics, they would not meet the conditions for being intellectually virtuous. And having so narrow a focus on topics that do not meet the objective conditions for significance, we can conclude that the necessary judgment component of the intellectual virtues is not operative. That's the negative framing. Here's the positive framing. The intellectually virtuous person will consistently do well by way of pursuing epistemically worthy topics. So again, lots to like here, though do feel free, Baer is in the room, so during our little Q&A, just direct all of your concerns at him, and then that will distract from the controversial points I'm about to make about vocation. Okay. So even though I grant that this way of thinking about the intellectual virtues goes some way toward addressing our problem of virtuous cognitive focus, I worry that it doesn't go quite far enough. Or better, I worry that there's a practical need for some form of epistemic direction not yet captured by Baer's appeal to epistemic significance. And in part, this is because even the limited domain of projects directed toward worthy intellectual questions is still far too vast to give individuals much by way of guidance regarding which to pursue. And even if we add in Baer's sensible inclusion of subjectivity by way of the value of freedom to choose the shape of our intellectual lives, we're left with a horizon of choice that, when conscientiously confronted, I contend, can still leave us overwhelmed and, in fact, stultified. So what would be nice would be to find a way to blend the universality of objective epistemic significance with the particularity of subjective contribution in a principled way, so that they're not just two massive platters on our cognitive dinner table, but rather harmonized to make a kind of composed and consumable epistemic dish. And as it turns out, this may very well be the way to conceive of the concept of a calling or a vocation. So my own thinking about the idea of calling has been fundamentally shaped by the account of moral vocation developed by Robert Adams. So here's how Robert Adams sets up the issues in his important book, Finite and Infinite Goods. He says this, quote, "Is there some task in the universe that's mine in a morally valid way? Are there ethical concerns that have my name on them, so to speak?" It's a very provocative way of putting it. The idea here, he says, is that there's such a thing, that there is such a thing as a very important one, that it might be difficult to live without. There are so many goods in the world that I could promote, so many needs in the world that I could try to meet. There's a danger that I will be either fragmented, going too many different ways, or crushed, seeing my obligations as unlimited, or immobilized by the clamor of competing claims. An idea of what is my task in the universe and what things are my things to care for may both impel me and free me to devote my attention to those things. End of quote. I imagine it's clear how much my own framing of the concern with the way good inquirers are to handle the radical epistemic value plurality owes to Adams' parallel concern here with moral value. Note that the problem is roughly a kind of practical one in Adams' mind. How are virtuous agents supposed to choose among all the moral goods commanding their attention? And to make the practical aspect explicit, notice that Adams characterized his positive idea about a calling as one that, quote, "it might be difficult to live without." And the suggestion I'm making is that this practical problem, together with Adams' practical solution, have strong epistemic analogs. We confront, that is, a parallel epistemic problem, and we do well to consider the parallel epistemic solution. There may be some tasks of inquiry in the universe that are yours in an epistemically valid way. There may be some intellectual projects that have your name on them. And to see how this idea of vocation is supposed to help, quick and dirty overview of a broader terrain that Adams is mapping here. On his view, the good person is for all that's morally good. Indeed, he thinks that virtue just is, to quote the subtitle of another of his important monographs, excellence in being for the good. That's what virtue is, excellence in being for the good. But of course, there are many different ways to be for moral goods. Perhaps the most basic way and the most common for the generally good person is not obstructing it, not opposing it or blocking it. But a person who only stayed out of the way of goods, didn't get in their way, didn't obstruct them, wouldn't necessarily demonstrate excellence in being for the good. And that's because good persons are for some goods in a more active and promotional way. They bring about some goods. They preserve, promote, defend, cherish some goods. But how does the good person choose which to be for in this stronger sense? Well, for some of these goods to have your name on them would be nice. But Adams doubts that we can get to that level of having our names on particular good projects just by way of attending to our moral obligations and standard forms of fit with the particular circumstances of our lives. So obviously this parallels my sense that the objective epistemic value of some forms of inquiry, together with local subjective features of my interests and curiosities, They're not going to settle the question of where to direct my epistemic attention. So what could write my name on some projects? Adam's answer is, quote, that vocation is primarily a matter of what goods are given to us to love, unquote. And my suggestion, you can see, is that some epistemic goods, some intellectual projects are given to us to love in distinctive ways. Say, like the way my grandchildren have been given to me to love, even while I must be fully for the flourishing of your grandchildren. Maybe I'm the only one with grandchildren in the room. You get the idea. And the reason that callings of this sort can help us is because they further delimit the range of things we ought to be pursuing. And this is in large part because on Adam's view, this kind of calling partly determines what we ought to be giving our time and energy to. He says, quote, my vocation claims me and it defines my responsibilities. For that reason, the topic of vocation belongs at least loosely to the obligation department of ethical theory and not just to the study of the good, unquote, he says. So notice where our callings would sit, very neatly between or at the intersection of that which objectively obligates us and that which subjectively appeals to us. A calling would have something of the force of normative demand, which would allow it to reasonably constrain the range of our commitments to alternative goods lacking this demand, but it would also attach to the specifics of ourselves, thereby diminishing worries about overburdened alienation. So might there be then epistemic projects, distinctive questions, or domains of inquiry that have your name on them in these ways? I'm powerfully attracted to a positive answer here. So while the intellectually virtuous person has to be for all of the epistemic goods, I find it plausible that some of these goods are given to each of us to love in specific ways, ways that bring our subjectivity together with objective value. Now we can note that Adams takes this idea of a kind of calling in the moral domain so seriously that he's prepared to make its accommodation a crucial feature of the right account of the moral life. That is, he tells us that, quote, if a view provides no satisfactory interpretation of this phenomenon, that's a disadvantage of the view. He thinks calling is a really important feature of an overarching moral outlook. Further, Adams claims that everyone has a moral vocation on his view. He thinks everyone's got one. Okay. On both of these points, that is with respect to the epistemic parallels, I find myself attracted to the claims that he's making here, but feel myself in no position to insist upon it. That is, I'm not so confident in the idea of epistemic calling that I would substantially discount any theory of epistemic value or epistemic virtue that didn't support it, nor am I prepared to insist that everyone does indeed have an epistemic vocation, though I think I see one for all of you. I can see it when I look out, it's just there. Okay. What I want to emphasize is that this idea of an epistemic vocation does have some independent plausibility, and it would allow us to make further headway with the general problem of cognitive distribution. And now I recognize that I've done a little more here than gesture at some suggestive parallels. Still, let me turn to some pedagogical implications very quickly, okay? So just suppose you were taking this idea of epistemic vocation seriously. Here's one pedagogical implication. The epistemically virtuous person should, I claim, be open and attentive to the possibility that she has an epistemic calling. So that is, it'll be a mark of good intellectual character that it disposes a person to this kind of openness and attentiveness. If you find that a person is, a deeply good epistemic agent in lots of ways, but totally dead to the possibility that they have an epistemic calling, it seems to me that this is some failure of their epistemic character. There's a second pedagogical implication. If anything like what I've been saying is right, then those of us who care about the cultivation of intellectually virtuous inquirers, I look around again, probably most of us, except Aaron James, he doesn't care about developing intellectually virtuous inquirers, but the rest of us do. If anything like that is right, then we also need to care about the possibility of these inquirers having an epistemic vocation. That is, in addition to helping them become curious, open-minded, intellectually careful, etc., we may need to help them reflect on the specific epistemic projects that have been given to them to pursue, distinctive epistemic goods that are theirs to love and promote, even while they're for all of the epistemic goods. And then finally, I'll just note that if we do accept this addition to our responsibilities as educators, we accept the idea that we need to help our students explore the possibility that they have epistemic callings. Then we might be particularly eager to pay attention to the wisdom traditions that have emphasized discernment in the realm of calling. So some traditions have developed rich modes and mechanisms for helping individuals become attuned to the possibility that their lives are supposed to have a particular shape. And I'd be remiss as an educator in a Jesuit institution not to underscore the fact that the Jesuits have a fair claim on being especially strong here. Ignatius of Loyola, particularly in his spiritual exercises, demonstrates great psychological and moral insight into this process. And similarly, Buddhist discernment, particularly with respect to the process of helping folks decide whether to become monks, offers us a great deal of practical wisdom regarding the uncovering of calling or vocation. So now I'm just going to end very abruptly by noting some questions that have been left unanswered that I want to continue to think about. Here they are. First one, what's the relationship between an epistemic vocation and a moral vocation? There's some kind of parallel between them, but how are they related? Second, can a coherent and sufficiently naturalistic account of epistemic calling be worked out? Adams is clear, he's thinking about his broadly within a theistic perspective, but he also wants it to be workable without those assumptions. Is it? And then two practical questions that you guys have already started pressing Jason on, and feel free to go back and keep pressing him. What can teachers actually do to help students discover their epistemic vocation? And what can institutions do to support the search for epistemic calling for students, if there is such a thing? That's what I got. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Like this. Okay, questions? And I'll bring a mic to you. I think so. It looks like that.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Thanks very much, Daniel. That's great. And great that you're using the Anteater.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for all the work you guys have already done, really.
Yeah, well, thank you for making use of this. It makes our life worthwhile. Yeah, so I think the problem you're tackling is like really deep and hard. I've been banging my head against a brick wall trying to engage with this very problem myself. Here's why I think there's two levels to it, and this is why I think it's so hard. One level is at the level of thinking about intellectual virtues as embedded within a virtuous life. I think this is the level you're at. Right? So then one advantage of working at that level, you can bring in other features of a good life, and you can bring in other features of a virtuous person, their moral virtues, you can bring in their practical wisdom and so on. So in part, you can explain how people make these kind of adjudications about what to care about, what to inquire about, by, for example, citing how, I'm not going to fixate on 70s baseball facts if that gets in the way of my moral duties to my family and friends, let's say. Right?
That's right.
Or because I've got practical wisdom, I'm going to have the good sense to realize some inquiries are pretty pointless or won't, and so on.
Yes.
Here's why I think it's deep, though. This problem, there's a deeper problem which arises even before you get to the moral and the practical rocks. Even if we factor out all of that, and we just focus on just the intellectual good and what it would be, caring about the truth in and of itself, there's something deeply puzzling even about that. So imagine the world's going to end in a few minutes, and you're offered two doors.
Yes.
Behind one door is like some trivial truth. How many spoons are in your kitchen cupboard? Now the other door is some deep, important truth about the universe. It's not going to matter to anything. Still, it seems to me, if you care about the truth, you go for that door.
Yeah.
And what that seems to, and moreover, here's the interesting thing: you go for that door because you care about the truth. It's not because you care about something else. Yeah. There's not some further value in play here. It's just what it is to care about the truth is go for that door. And what those sort of thought experiments reveal, it seems to me, is that what it is to value truth cannot be understood as valuing all truths equally.
Yes.
So already there's this, what it is to, as it were, weigh truth.
Yes.
Truth as a weight, as it were,
yes.
Which is not to be weighed in terms of counting true propositions. It's got, there are some truths, as it were, that latch on to how things are or something. And that's where it gets really deep. And it seems, I kind of feel like, this is why I've struggled with this, I feel like I've got to answer that problem before I can make any headway of anything else, because I've got to understand what it is the intellectual good is and what it is to value intellectual good, before I can even make sense of how the intellectual good plays out with regard to all these other goods.
That sucks, yeah. Thanks for that, Duncan. Yeah, I mean, one thing I can't help but register here is, though I do think that there's something, that is a deep problem, and maybe the deep problem. We do seem to get ourselves around it in some respects. So here's the thing that strikes me, if you don't mind me saying about you and about Jason. And that's that I think you both have a pretty clear conception of your epistemic callings. I don't feel that quite as well as I know Jason's case better than I know yours, of course. But I think Jason, from the time he was 24, maybe, knew intellectual virtue. That's what I'm giving my attention to. It's framed the sense of his own. He's got lots of other things to care about, of course, and he does care about them, but that constrains the framing about a lot of the things he'll give his attention to. I sense the same thing is true for you. I feel more torn and stultified by the fact that, wait, there are so many goods. And how would and I find myself trying to get them in some kind of rank order. And what I guess I'd been hoping, and I can't tell if this is landing for you, Duncan, is that something like calling could, in some respects, get around. I'm not saying we don't still try to answer your question. Let's keep thinking about that. It's just philosophically important. But insofar as we all have to go forward as epistemic agents, and our students have to go forward as learners, it's a way around that seems to be in terms of calling. Like some have my name on them, and even though I haven't yet worked out, is inquiry into being qua being more important than inquiry into the structure of mind, or I don't know. But I can help my students see if there's something that she's been given to love, and something that, and you're not stultified. Could anybody be less intellectually stultified than Duncan? I mean, he is always producing things, so he is not at all stultified. So it's not stopping you, is it?
No.
It isn't. Do you think this is right? It's in part because
Well, that book manuscript is on the shelf.
Well, okay, fair enough. There is that, yeah. But isn't it in part because, and I'm not trying to over-psychologize you in front of a room of your colleagues and people who obviously hate you, but isn't it because you do have a pretty sharp picture of the fact that you have a set of epistemic goods that are distinctively given to you to love? Or is that too heavy-handed to describe? Because I am open to the fact that sounds too heavy-handed, even though, I love Robert Adams and he's putting it that way morally. You're going to take the questions right, because I don't.
Sure, hi, Tim. Thanks. I like the subjective side of the picture, so it's, it's not just the objective rank value, but some attraction or disposition to offer. But I'm just worried that your way of framing it is too self-referential. Like,
Good.
There's something that's my calling, and I can see the appeal for students to say, what's your special calling? It's sort of like what you might ask still, by the way, how can I make the greatest contribution, given what I bring and what's needed?
Yes.
Right. What's not known? What's not understood? What's some way I can advance understanding or knowledge, or
Good.
Like that. And that's still a distinctive sort of match or confluence between what's already there, what's already working on. That might not be the most important thing that there is to understand at all, right? And it might be, if all goes well, I get credit for my contribution.
Yeah.
My name gets put on it.
Yeah.
But it could be the case that I make the best contribution creatively, and no one is never recognized. And I just, in supporting a bunch of other efforts, and I see that sort of in the background the way that my contribution is a platform for other people who get credit across the board.
Yeah.
Get credit, they get credit for it. And I can still think, well, that's fine. I sort of still made the contribution that in some sense I was felt I should make, or I was called to make, but it's not because it was mine or recognized as mine necessarily. So can you clarify that? Yeah.
I don't know if I can. I really like the point. I can feel what you're driving at about the way the language and the way I'm using it can have us bent a little bit too much in on ourselves. I do think that part of the trick is getting this objective value to connect up to the subjective and personal aspect. There's this line from this, any of you know this person, Frederick Buechner. He's got this writer, poet, thoughtful person, who he describes calling as the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep need meet. Like what makes you fundamentally glad, what moves you and inspires you, but it's connected up to some objective good. I'm with you, Aaron, in being worried that if you frame that in such a way that it's still a matter of you trying to get a bunch of credit for this, as opposed to trying to figure out how to go forward in the world, responding properly to epistemic value when it's a blooming, buzzing confusion. Here's one way, find the things that are most deeply gladdening to me, but that hook up with the world in important ways and make a contribution to that. That seems like a kind of a healthy, again, lots to work out about what that would mean and how you would get it and how we would help students get it, but it's painting a picture that I'm still finding attractive. And I think we can keep it from being overly self-concerned.
Thank you. I'm wondering, even if we admit that we do have an epistemic calling, it seems, maybe I'm missing the point, but it seems like there's other epistemic goods that are maybe imperative for us, and maybe they're not even things we're interested in. Like maybe I'm like, Michael in youth, and I think politics is not important.
Yeah.
But maybe that's not really a choice, or let's say religious truth or something. We should still spend some time trying to figure out what the truth is in those regards. So how do we manage this?
That's a really good point. I take it. Whatever an epistemic calling might be, it doesn't. What Adam says about calling, right, is it's on the obligation side of the moral life. So think of it that way epistemically here. But he doesn't think it's obligation per se. And I can have obligations, epistemic ones, it seems to me, that just trump my calling, right? I mean, if it turns out, my grandkids have some dread disease. This is kind of a classic, what's the name of the case? Lorenzo's oil. If my grandkid has a dread disease and I'm the only person who can try to figure out how to handle that disease, even if I had thought, and reasonably so, I had this calling to do philosophy and to help people think through intellectual character or what have you. Well, my grandkids need me to do this. I got to go become an expert in that now. And it does seem like those can trump, right? So part of the dialectic here is what a calling does is it's in the spirit of obligation, right? But it can be trumped by other moral ones. That seems exactly right to me. Yeah. It's part of what's hard about the case.
Thank you so much. I love the idea of intellectual calling. You said something before about how the intellectual virtues can position you to heed that call.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, you can only heed the call in being intellectually virtuous? I mean, I worry about people who, people who do the most damage, actually, are ones who really do have a calling and they heed it and they pursue it doggedly without cultivating intellectual virtue.
Nice. Yeah. You could have an intellectual calling and respond to it in some sense well, but still be a kind of epistemic asshole. Yeah, I think that's right. I see that that's not completely, that doesn't seem totally incoherent to me. It can be like that. And now I don't know how to envision the various comparators. Well, all I was hoping, though, was that I might be able to talk a few of us into the idea that an openness to your own epistemic calling would be a feature or of your being an epistemically virtuous person. The way Jason puts it is that he thinks that these questions about epistemic significance are built into the judgment component of the virtues, right? So in addition, you just take the virtue of open-mindedness. He thinks that virtue is partly constituted by having a certain kind of capacity to take on other views, but also a judgment component that has to do with, is this the right time to take on other views? Good judgment about that. And I take it, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, you also think that judgment component is a kind of built-in capacity to make good judgments about what's important, right?
Here's my suggestion, and I think Jason might be taking this, has already been inclined to take it on. It's a feature of that, it's also a feature of that judgment component of this virtue that you're alive, that along that line, you're alive to the possibility that you have a calling, right? An epistemic calling. That's part of the judgment feature of the virtues. So the judgment features of the virtues work together to point you in the direction that maybe there's a thing, kind of set of questions or projects given to you to love, especially they have your name on them. But I really like the point that you could be pretty dedicated to your epistemic calling and do a lot of epistemic good and not be particularly intellectually virtuous. Doesn't that sound you could do that? I'm looking to my virtue theoretic experts. Doesn't it seem like, yeah, you could fulfill the calling, but not be very intellectually virtuous in doing it? Yeah.
We have time for one last
Well,
question.
just a comment. I think this idea of the epistemic calling is very important for the professions.
And one thing I was thinking about this when I was driving over this morning, especially about the practical points about how could we help our students, is that some of us have already made our peace with these things. I picked these two just because I mean, they're really dedicated in their ways to the things that it seems to me they have been called to. But one of the good things about graduate education and then the academy more generally is it can start to look a lot like what we're doing in graduate education, probably in undergraduate education too, when you're thinking about how people are deciding what majors to be. But in graduate education, when you're trying to hone in on a lot of that is there some domain set of questions that's been given to you to love? It's going to give a shape to your life that makes sense of where your deep gladness and the world's deep need comes together. A lot of us are doing that already, and this is just maybe a language that we can lay on top of that to some degree.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.